I stared at a blank page for a really, really long time, trying to start to write this sermon. This is another week in the world when talking about the love of God as a solution to the world's ills just seems hopelessly inadequate, if not dangerously naive. In Charlottesville, Virginia, the KKK and other white supremacists marched in huge numbers on Friday and Saturday. They don't even bother wearing masks anymore. The governor declared a state of emergency. Some of our friends and UCC clergy colleagues were in the streets making a witness for justice, or barricaded in a church surrounded by men carrying guns legally and holding torches. And then the coup de grace, a young white man drove his car at top speed into a crowd of young activists, their bodies tossed in the air like confetti before driving away. He killed one of them and wounded many others physically and wounded countless others emotionally and spiritually. And let's not forget that earlier this week, the specter of nuclear war, swift and disastrous, has risen from its dusty slumber. Some of us have been watching the news ticker nonstop, praying for cooler heads to prevail, relearning what to do if a nuclear weapon is detonated, say, 10 miles away, and we're not immediately obliterated, but have to live in the aftermath. At times like this, a story about the Daffy disciples not having enough bread and Jesus' exasperation with them seems quaint and utterly irrelevant. Because I meant to preach a sermon on how to love after you've been hurt, how not to let bad breakups or flawed parents or any other way that love can go wrong keep us from loving again. But it seems so trivial in the light of those tiki torches held by Richard Spencer and his minions, in the light of a mushroom cloud over San Francisco or LA. Hence the blank page. And yet, like many of you, I've been sitting with our Bible and a blank page for a very long time, and I think we know by now that if we're willing to sit quietly enough and to let God get in a word edgewise, we will get some wisdom that will help us go on living and living with fierce joy. Because we know that in every atom of the Bible, even the strange and wonky and inscrutable bits, the same Spirit pulses. The Morse code message of love, if we have the eyes to see it and the ears to hear it. So let's begin. The disciples are in the boat with Jesus, headed across the lake. It's not a long trip, but they're freaking out about not having enough snacks. And Jesus is just trying to teach them something. Beware, he says, beware the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. Of course, he's talking about his two main political and religious rivals, the ones that have been trying to end Jesus and his movement by any means necessary. I can imagine he was trying to teach the disciples about how insidiously false religious teachings work, about politics disguised as religion, about scapegoating and dog whistle calls to religious purity, and the way that class power functions to maintain the status quo. But the disciples are just worried about their next meal. And they're imagining Jesus is judging them for not having brought enough bread. Ugh! How's he going to get anywhere with these people? I think the religious term is Jesus loses his mind. Why are you still talking about bread? Do you have no idea what's going on out there, people? And when have you gone hungry once? Have you already forgotten those 2 miraculous feedings I just did? How much was left over the first time? Right, 12 baskets. How much was left over the second time? 7. Geez. when are you going to trust me? When are you going to believe? The fundamental problem is the disciples are still living by the myth of scarcity. It doesn't matter how many times they experience the miraculous, generous, supererogatory love of God in the most tangible terms possible, with 12 baskets overflowing. They keep defaulting to the fear that there's not enough. They live in a world of simple math, addition and subtraction. More for you means less for me. And they don't yet understand that God is a multiplier, that God is quantum, that God is thinking and moving and creating circles around us. And for this reason, Jesus calls the disciples hard-hearted. Hard-hearted. It's kind of a weird thing to call them. Hard-headed, maybe. Rocks for brains. But hard-heartedness implies frostiness or cruelty. The disciples may be idiots and cowardly and prone to overly worry about what's for dinner, but they're not cruel. And yet the end result of an unwillingness to see and hear and trust and be whatever the opposite of hard-hearted is sometimes cruelty. What if they'd refused to follow Jesus' instructions at the miraculous feedings and all those people went hungry? Or what if in their fear that there was not enough, they let that fear crystallize into anger and aggression and not only withheld from others, but started taking what did not belong to them? Not just bread, the means of living, but the very lives bread is intended to preserve. The Greek word for hard-hearted is sclerocardia. Sclerotic veins are gunked up veins that won't let blood through to the heart, and a heart that itself is sclerotic. Hard, can't do what it is supposed to do. It can't love. Today I was going to preach on love and God's crazy math. I was going to say that just like we sang at the beginning of worship today, love is something. If you give it away, you end up having more. I was going to say that hard-heartedness, the one Jesus accuses the disciples of, is an end result of buying into the myth of scarcity. The myth that I have to get what I need first, but before I can begin to give you what you need, and there's not enough, so someone has to go without. And of course, we know that when it comes to love, the myth of scarcity is a sham. It's obvious to a toddler that love must be given away to, in fact, be love, because love withheld is not love at all. It's hard-heartedness. It's so interesting to me that the battle cry of the white supremacists in Charlotte was, "You will not replace me." Or more specifically, "Jew will not replace me." It doesn't sound like a neo-Nazi war slogan so much as the whine of a jilted boyfriend. "You will not replace me." It's the threat of the abuser who mistakes total control over another human being for love. But I also hear in it the fear of abandonment, of irrelevancy, the scarcity myth at play. There aren't enough jobs, there isn't enough wealth, there isn't enough room for me here anymore. You want to disappear me, so I am going to disappear you first. I'm going to do to you what I fear you will do to me if you get the upper hand. And that's what's known as projection. When you can't bear to see the ugliest or saddest or most fearful thing in your own heart, when you can't bear your own vulnerability, you project it onto the other. And I long to answer their cry in a way their ears will hear. We don't want to replace you. We want to include you. We want everyone to be included. We want everyone to have enough. There are not many sides. There is only one side. But we can't really know this until we're able to see God, God the great unifier, God the common denominator in every single other. Richard Rohr said that God's universal love is recognizing oneself in the other by realizing they are not other. But this takes a great deal of willingness to be vulnerable and open to our own sin and to the full humanity of others. And so many of us are trained to hard-heartedness. Because what if we are vulnerable and it comes back to haunt us? What if we give our love away and we don't end up having more? What would that do to us? We want to protect ourselves from future wants and hurts. And we find it hard to believe. We find it hard to believe anyone trustworthy of our hearts, so we keep them to ourselves. We adopt a bunker mentality against love, against any future vulnerability. And then we are safe. With a preemptive strike, no one can hurt us. But at what cost? What is an acceptable price for our safety? We can ask this question personally when we've been through a bad breakup or are wrangling in a tense marriage, or when we become parents and find that our hearts are now walking around outside our bodies. And we can ask this question: what's an acceptable price for our safety as a neighborhood and a nation? The hermit kingdom of North Korea is not the only one with a bunker mentality. How do we, especially white people and people with a little money, insulate ourselves from the pain and need of our neighbors and beyond? How do we exempt ourselves from the struggle for full equality and the well-being of all human beings? And in the question of what may happen in the standoff with North Korea, who is expendable in the pursuit of my security? Is it okay with me if 10 million people in Seoul die to draw fire from San Francisco? And even closer to home, the white supremacists are on tour. They are targeting liberal cities in the West as a way of striking at the heart of the left. And they are coming back to Berkeley in 2 weeks. I've been ignoring them thus far. I told myself they weren't worthy of attention. I did not want to amplify their signal or give them what they want. But the whole truth is, I've also ignored them because I haven't wanted to get hurt. I have children to think about. I did not want to put myself on the line. But at what cost comes my safety, my invulnerability? We will only dismantle racism in America when enough white people decide to risk their necks for black and brown people, when we are visible in great numbers in the public square, answering misdirected hatred with holy love and soul force. Brené Brown, the sociologist and vulnerability guru, says that faith minus vulnerability equals extremism. Wow. Faith minus vulnerability equals extremism. She says spirituality is inherently vulnerable, that it means believing in things we can't see. It means living not by a math that is addition or subtraction, but by a physics that is quantum. It means stop worrying about what's for dinner like the disciples and find our power to feed the world. Jesus called his disciples hard-hearted. What if the opposite of being hard-hearted is not being soft-hearted, but being broken-hearted? What if that's our Christian vocation? To be not half-hearted, but wholehearted. Not hard-hearted, but broken-hearted. So whether we are healing from a wounding breakup, or wondering how to keep our kids safe as they grow, or absorbing the possibility of nuclear war, or staring down white supremacists, we are called to vulnerability and to love. We are called to wholehearted, tender-hearted, broken-hearted living, because the alternative is a fate worse than death. Amen.